Hello and welcome to Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University. I'm Steve Huffner, the Deputy Director of our election law program here at OSU. And I'm joined again today by Tony Goggin and Terry Enns, Senior Fellows of our election law program. But we're especially excited today to have with us Bridget Dooling, a colleague of ours here at Moritz, whose specialty is administrative law. And today we're going to talk about some presidential transition issues as a slightly broadened focus of our Law and Democracy podcast, since our fall episodes were all concentrated more narrowly on election law topics, but we're broadening now a little bit. And Bridget comes to Ohio State after about a decade of experience in the federal government, working in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and then having served on the Biden-Harris transition team in late fall of 2000 up through Inauguration Day of 21. So we are excited to have you here, Bridget, and look forward to being able to talk about that topic in particular today. So with that, let's get going. Tony, I'm going to leave it to you to pose a first question to Bridget.
Yes, Steve. So, Bridget, could you begin by providing an view of what your duties entailed with the Biden-Harris transition team in 2020, 2021?
Yeah, sure. And first, thanks for having me on. It's a really good time in the presidential cycle to be talking about transition issues. And I think transitions are kind of a black box. They're a very short period of time. It's just this period of time between the election and really when the election results are known, and then Inauguration Day. So at least when I served on a transition team, I haven't done the exact math to make sure it's the same, but it was 78 days. And so that's not a lot of time for a whole organization to stand up and bring people on and execute their mission and then immediately pull the plug on themselves, right? I mean, the transition really is this liminal phase between the election oriented, like the campaign staff, and the folks who are actually going to go into government and govern. So it is this very unusual short role that I was privileged to be a part of. And I started doing that work with gusto, I suppose, once we knew that President Biden had won the election, but there was a little bit of work to be done, ahead of an actual election day and the days following. I was more involved in that post-election period, although there were people that were brought on to be more like full-time staffers, doing operations work, doing IT work, doing strategic work for the transition even before election day. So there's a fair bit of transition work that happens even before the election, which makes sense. I mean, you can't just sort of flip a switch and have this large organization just pop up. You have to lay some groundwork for it. So my role was as an agency review team member. Agency reviews teams basically are agency specific, as you might infer from the name. So there's one for the Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, et cetera, all the way through the alphabet soup of federal agencies. And I was on the one for the agency where I used to work, which is the Office of Management and Budget. And an agency review team is only one piece of a transition team, but the mission of an agency review team is to sort of do, I like to think of it as, are you familiar with the term SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats? So it's sort of like, where's the agency at? Where is it strong? Where is it weak? Where does it have challenges on the horizon? And where is it particularly well positioned in terms of the larger landscape of government and the political landscape? So you're basically doing a rapid crash course on the agency, its policies, its personnel, its vulnerabilities, just trying to get all this information gathered so that you can brief the incoming officials who, early in the days of a transition, you might not know who the nominees are going to be. That's part of the work of a transition, is to figure out how to staff a new administration. So once those folks are identified, the agency review teams help get those future appointees up to speed so that they can go in on January 20th and hit the ground running. They don't have to do this whole assessment themselves once they finally get into government. So basically, it's helping them get up to speed in order to be able to govern. So there's a research component. There's also just a briefing component, to get folks up to speed. And then because I was working for the OMB agency review team, OMB's unique role in coordinating budget matters and according regulatory matters and IT policy and a whole bunch of other matters meant that we were also sort of dual hatted within the transition. We were also running a number of policy processes to help the transition get a number of policy matters as far along baked as you could in the context of a transition.
Bridget, you mentioned 78 days as the transition period, and that I think runs from or ran from election day through inauguration day. But in particular, in the 2020 transition period, there was quite a delay before the official activities were allowed to begin with a sort of government blessing. There is this process that maybe we can talk about at some point in this episode that is under the Presidential Transition Act, and that didn't happen. I mean, the official commencement of that process didn't happen until quite late. In the interim between election day or the day after election day and when there was an official acknowledgement that the Biden administration could staff up a transition team, what kinds of things were happening just in that preliminary interval?
Yeah. So, Steve, you're talking about what we call the process of ascertainment, or the process by which the government sort of figures out how to recognize who won the election. And you're right, that was delayed in the transition from Trump to Biden. I can't remember the exact number of days, but something like 20 days or something like that. So when you think about a transition having about 78 days to work with, taking 20 of those days away is a really meaningful chunk of that transition time. But we were able to do a lot without being able to, actually go into the agencies. And for reasons that I will admit have never been entirely clear to me, the Trump team's posture was that prior to ascertainment, that we were not to be working directly with the agencies. That set us back. That's not so clear in the Presidential Transition Act that it has to be that way, but those decisions were linked, at least by the Trump administration, and so we were really held at arm's length. We, the transition team, were held at arm's length from the agencies. But there's lots you can do even if you can't actually go in to the agencies. You can
Well,
talk
and
to lots of folks.
of course, you were in the agency already.
I was
Right?
not actually. I
You
was
were out at
working
that
at
point.
GW at that point. Yeah, so
Okay.
I was an outsider at that point. Yeah, that's right. So
Okay.
And Bridget, that raises a question for me. Who are the folks that are on the transition team? If it's not the campaign folks, then it's not the incoming folks. Who are the kinds of people that get tapped to do this work?
yeah, it's interesting because some folks from the campaigns do flow onto a transition team. Um, some are folks who will ultimately be nominees or appointees in the new administration. And then there's people like me who, have a full-time gig elsewhere. At the time, I was a research professor at GW, and I wasn't looking to go into the administration, but I wanted to help. And particularly for the role that they picked me for, it was a good fit, right? I had worked at this agency for over 10 years. I knew it really well. I knew a lot of the people that are still working there. I know it's sort of folkways, and I know it's statutory authorities, right? So folks like me who have experience either mostly working in, but also working with from the outside, are often people who get put on the agency review teams for particular agencies. And also some folks that don't have that background. I mean, we had people if the agency review team for OMB was something like, I don't know, 10 or 12 people, 10 people. Some of them had never stepped foot in OMB as an agency, but they had some other area of expertise or area of policy knowledge where the folks putting the team together thought they'd be a good fit. So, as with all sort of teams, like a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of backgrounds, the theory is all of that rolls up into doing, higher quality briefing and analysis.
How closely, Bridget, did you work with the outgoing Trump administration?
So, that evolved over the transition period. Myself, because of the nature of my role, I was not in contact with a lot of Trump officials by virtue of what I was doing on agency review. But there were other folks who had more of a reason to be in direct communication with political appointees in the outgoing administration. Where I spent most of my time was talking to people, career staff in the Office of Management and Budget, as well as talking to stakeholders and other folks with relevant knowledge to sort of put into that large research analysis project that we were doing about the sort of overall status and state of the agency. And so there was a fair bit of conversation between me and currently serving civil servants, but less so with the outgoing political appointees. And that's typical. I mean, typically what the transition process about is less about the handoff from one political apparatus to another and sort of more about helping the incoming political apparatus connect into, the depths of a federal agency, which is not going to be its, politically oriented leadership. I think there's probably some difference in the national security community where I imagine there was more conversation at higher levels of agencies for certain things. You think about like classified briefings and that kind of thing. My role was more on the domestic policy side, so there was just less of that.
So you were already tapped before the ascertainment event occurred to be part of the transition process. And I'm sure that was true for maybe most of the people, but how much did the work you were doing change after ascertainment?
Once ascertainment was done, we were able to get in there and really start working with the civil servants. That was the big change of ascertainment, because up until that point, we were talking with outsiders, basically. And so as soon as we got that green light of ascertainment, we were able to do much more one-to-one. Actually, we were able to do any one-to-one conversation with the civil servants at the agencies. So that's a real game changer, because you can gather all kinds of atmospheric information from outsiders, but you really want to know, like, how many vacancies are there at the career level? What's your budget situation? You just want to be able to talk about, I mean, even things that you wouldn't necessarily think about, but like, how's the IT migration going for these various systems? What's the book of business on the litigation side of the agency? Where do we stand with all those matters? So there's a lot of that you just kind of can't get anywhere else. So that's why most transition teams are so eager to get in, is because they just want to, hoover up as much information as they can in order to prep the incoming officials.
And does the transition team itself grow in numbers after ascertainment? Do you bring more people on board the transition team, or is it pretty well fixed?
That's interesting. I mean, we didn't, but there's nothing to stop you from doing that. I mean, what's sort of interesting about transition teams is that they are not governmental entities. They are sort of the separate, usually organized into a nonprofit type of organization that exists for a very short period of time. They hire, they fire, they keep records, they have attorneys, they have ethics matters, right? So there's nothing to really prevent a transition team from staffing up after ascertainment. But my general
And
instinct is that you kind of want the team that you're going to need from the jump, because again, we're only talking about, 3 months of time. Yeah.
but you get office space and you get funding with ascertainment.
That's true. Sorry. Yes, I left that out. So one quirk of this current transition that we're in right now, as well as the one that I was in, was that the delay in ascertainment meant that basically the transitions had to self-fund. So once, and let me back up a little bit to say that what you're getting at is that as soon as the General Services Administration ascertains the apparent successful candidate of the election, that's some legal jargon for you to say, once GSA figures out who the winner was, then that unlocks, a pot of money, that unlocks access to government office space, that unlocks IT support from GSA, and access to some electronic systems that prior to ascertainment and prior to signing certain agreements between the transition team and the government that's about to exit, that you can't access those things. So yeah, in a more typical transition, you would ascertain sooner, and all of those pieces would start to fall in place sooner. What we were in right now and what we were in the Biden-Harris transition team was a period where ascertainment was delayed, and so all of those resources basically were cut off as well. The practical reality of that is that the transitions receive donations from outside parties to fund their salaries. I was unpaid, for example, but a number of people on the transition were in paid roles. There's computers to buy, there's security systems to build out, and that's not free, right? So this current transition and the prior one did a fair bit of fundraising to basically self-fund and not rely on that GSA money, which is only, I think it's something like $2 or $3 million. So it's not huge dollars as government money goes, but it's sizable.
So prior to ascertainment, Bridget, where were you and other transition team members physically located, since presumably you didn't have access, as you said, to government offices? Where did you do your work?
Yeah. So, but I mean, recall the time period that we were talking about, right? Because this is
COVID.
2020, right? So we were all in a remote posture. And I think we probably would have been, whether we had access to office space or not. That was just a quirk of the timing and the fact that, so many amazing technical solutions were available to us to allow us to get our work done from all across the country. So on the OMB agency review team, for example, I did all of my work from Colorado because I could. So I never had to go to DC for anything. I think some of again, on the NatSec side of things, when you're working inside the secure areas, you have to be in the secure room, right? What we
In a
call the
SCIF
skiff, in a
somewhere.
skiff, exactly. So those folks needed to be able to go in and be cleared for, in-person involvement. Again, my work wasn't on the NatSec side, so I didn't need to do that, and I was able to do everything I needed to do remotely. Yeah, but that did give us the opportunity to have, we had a team member who was living in California, actually a couple of folks in California, and me in Colorado, and a number of people were in DC anyway, but we were all, just like we are on Zoom now, we were all using, video and shared documents to get our work done.
And once again, as an example of always fighting the last battle, the Presidential Transition Act amendments, if that's exactly what they were called, in 2022 came along to try and reduce the likelihood that we'd have a recurrence of this 20-day gap before the General Services Administration could ascertain the one winner by permitting there to be, potential of two, and that the transition program would make funding and office space available to both if we have a repeat like that. Is that a correct
Yeah, that's
description?
right. So that was the 2022 amendments to a law called the Presidential Transition Act. And maybe I'll just digress a little bit to say something about that statute, because for a very long time, basically until, if I'm right, I'm just going to look at my date here. I think it was 1963. The presidential transitions were just governed by norms, and transition periods were sort of just more ad hoc and structured around the particular preferences of the incoming candidate. Some presidential candidates famously took vacation after the election. Elections are grueling, exhausting, and sometimes you might want to sail away and have a little breather before you come on. So different from our modern expectations about what a presidential transition are. And around the 1960s, of course, my slide isn't loading with the dates, but I'm pretty sure it was 63 or so. Congress enacted the Presidential Transition Act to start to put some structure around it, and there have been 7 amendments to that act over time that have tended to be in response to some sort of phenomenon. So, for example, wanting to beef up the national security briefings that are going on between the outgoing administration and the incoming administration. That happened in response to 9/11 and the possibility that, although this was not really borne out in any particular way, but the mere possibility that in a presidential transition, critical intelligence might not get to the right people and get sort of briefed up so that apparatus is capable of functioning really well across a presidential transition. So there were some statutory amendments to address that. This most recent round that Steve's referring to was in response to the sort of ascertainment debacle of the 2020 election, where we had this delay and we had a presidential candidate that refused to concede, and was interested in pursuing lots of litigation to hold open the possibility that he had won the election. The practical effect of that is that everything about the transition was sort of in more of a wobbly state than it would otherwise have been in. So the 2022 amendment makes it, as Steve said, gives GSA the ability to recognize two apparent successful candidates. Again, that's the technical legal term. GSA is not actually deciding who the winner is, right? That's not GSA's job. We do that, right, with our votes. But GSA basically takes sort of official legal notice of the winner, which then unlocks, certain things that can flow, like we talked about funding, IT support, et cetera. So with the 22 amendments, that gives GSA the ability to basically say, okay, we're going to treat you two as apparent successful candidates while you sort out these legal challenges or recounts or whatever's going on, so that the transitions can basically get going in parallel in the event of a contested election.
And so that's an example of now reforming the law to try to reduce a problem or eliminate a problem we've seen before. And those types of legal improvements, legal reforms are all to the good, but it also seems to me that the chances of a repeat of what we saw in 2020 are relatively small. That in the 60 years now since we've had a presidential transitions act, we haven't had that problem until 2020. And if we have it again, we now have an act that's responsive, will allow things to go better. But the question that I'm really then leading to is to wonder, what is it about the act that's still not right? For some future possible contingency, which maybe we should be anticipating, or maybe it's impossible to anticipate. But from the standpoint of the law of democracy, I'm just wondering what an idealized presidential transition act might look like.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's helpful to take this out of the sort of whack-a-mole rhythm that it's been in, because we see Congress. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we have this notion of modern Congresses not actually tackling hard problems, right? And yet in this space, I mean, they have amended this statute, 7 times, which is actually a lot compared to other similarly aged statutes. So you do see Congress coming back and sort of tending to the statute, but it tends to be in a reactive mode rather than in a proactive mode. And so I don't know if I have a great answer for you. I can tell you that some folks have written on this. There's a wonderful recent article from Michael Hers and Kate Shaw, basically going through the Transition Act and just trying to think about, is this serving the way that we work now? And so they have some reform proposals. I mean, one of the ones that is more in the vein of reactive, for me, at least right now, is that we have the Trump transition team that has declined to do a portion of what you would expect candidates to do, president-elects to do, and that is causing some challenges with this transition right now. So I'll get more specific. Once you have achieved ascertainment, right, meaning once the apparent successful candidate has been identified by GSA, then the expectation is that the transition teams will sign 3 agreements. One with the White House, which governs access to agencies, one with the General Services Administration, which governs that pot of money, it governs IT support, and some other, like access to office space, for example. One with the Justice Department, which governs like background checks, for example. So the incoming Trump team signed only one of those agreements. They signed the one with the White House, which gives the transition team access to agency personnel and some other matters as well. What they have declined to sign includes the GSA agreement, which turns on the flow of money from GSA, but it also, one of the features of the statute, or bugs of the statute, I suppose, is that if you don't receive the money from GSA, you're not obliged to disclose who is on the transition team. So right now, for example, while we've seen some one-off reporting about who is on the transition team, it's very siloed and it's not comprehensive at all. So for example, I've been interested to know who's on the OMB agency review team because I'm interested, right? It tells you something about the incoming administration, what they value, whose perspective they're seeking, and we can't get it, right? Because the Trump administration or the incoming, the transition team has declined to sign the agreement that would then trigger the responsibility to disclose it. Of course, the transition team could disclose all of this if they wanted to, but they have opted not to, right? Which leaves us all in the dark about who is doing this work. So I think that's one of the aspects of the Transition Act that's being revealed right now and may well be the subject of a future reform, but that's much more in the vein of like reacting to whatever the most recent crisis was. I mean, Steve, you also raised the question of whether we would have a repeat of what happened in after the 2020 election. And I think had we not had a scenario where Harris conceded, I think we very well could have, right? We very well could have had a contested election this time around. So I'm not persuaded that we won't be in a 2020 type scenario again. That, of course, opens up all kinds of other questions about how is GSA going to figure out the point at which, contested election litigation is sort of sufficiently settled to ascertain the winner, right? So like even the 22 amendments, which is meant to be responsive to, sort of past problems, opens up other cans of worms that we, are sort of laying in wait for us now for the future.
Yeah, well, I know you and others too have talked about whether GSA even ought to be trying to make that call or whether it should be triggered in some other way. And so,
Right. And the question is who, right? I mean, we don't really have any. I mean, when I sit down to think about, okay, well, if not GSA, then who? I mean, I don't know. But it's a really tricky question. And anytime you're in a contested election scenario, as you know better than most people on the planet, right? It's going to be fraught, like almost by definition. So the idea that you can just hand this over to the technocrats to figure out an answer is I don't know, that hasn't worked in other scenarios, let's put it that way. So it is a really tricky thing to ask any agency to do. And so with that in mind, it's like, well, why not GSA, right? Like, I mean, is anybody else better positioned to figure this stuff out? I don't know.
And maybe Trump's approach is not a one-off. Maybe this is what all future incoming administrations
Right.
will do, which in a way will let GSA off the hook. There's a parallel in election law with regard to presidential campaign funding, public funds used for that are available to the nominees of the two parties and minor parties for that matter, which I believe every candidate availed themselves of from the 70s until 2008, when John McCain accepted the public funds, but Barack Obama didn't because he didn't want the strings that were attached to
Yep.
them because he knew he could greatly outraise McCain if he didn't take public funds.
Yep.
And I believe no candidate of either party has accepted the public funds since the precedent established by Obama. So it seems to me history would suggest, which Trump's approach with regard to GSA is something we'll probably see future Democratic presidents do as well.
Yeah. Yeah. The question is whether that, pot of money, access to office space, right? All the IT support that comes with the GSA agreement is sort of worth the consequences of it. And I can understand why a transition team might say, no, no, thanks. We've got our own IT folks. We've got our own ability to house our people, and we're able to do private fundraising that more than takes care of, what we need. Who loses in the process? Okay, sure. Maybe we save a few $1,000,000 out of the federal, appropriations, but that is our hook under the Presidential Transition Act. And maybe there's another parallel to that campaign financing. We lose the transparency, right? All of that transparency is sort of connected back to the receipt of that funding. So I think that calls into question the structure and the assumption that folks will want to get access to the GSA services because now we're seeing folks able to forego it.
so for purposes of more transparency, would it be sensible and feasible to put the transition group which is playing a sort of quasi-public role, arguably, under the umbrella of like the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So that there would be some requirements independent of the funding source, that if
Yep.
you're involved in transition activities that include the opportunity to consult with employees of the federal government and the current administration, that then you are in like the Advisory Committee Act
Yeah.
umbrella, or, you know, we might have to amend that act or create a different act, but they
Yep.
could similarly require more disclosure.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the trick would be how to draw the line for sort of who's included, because I mean, for example, there's lots of people that would probably say that they're involved with the presidential transition because they're serving in some sort of informal advisor capacity, or they helped draft something, or they put some names in the personnel hopper. You know, for example, it is a different kind of role to actually be going in, as you say, to the agencies and representing the transition team to the agencies, right? And so you certainly want to capture, I think that's actually a pretty good place to draw the lines, which is where the Transition Act draws the line now, that like if you're going to be sending people into agencies, those names need to be disclosed. And I think as a practical matter, I mean, a lot of good flows from that kind of disclosure. There's one thing for us all to be able to see who it is, but also, I mean, think about think about being in an agency and someone just shows up and is like, "I'm from the transition team," and you're like, "Are you? How do you how do you figure it out?" You know, at least, and like when I was on the Biden Harris transition team, there was a very specific website where you could control F my name and I was there, right? So you could see if I was on or if I wasn't on. And so this really forces, and we have to think through the trade-offs of this, but like this really forces the transition team to only come through sort of one vector at the tippy top of an agency, you know, kind of be verified and said like, okay, now you can come talk to people, which maybe that's a good idea anyway, but it just increases the administrative burdens on particularly the agency staff to figure out who they can talk to and who they can't. And how do you actually verify that in any way that's satisfying to you, rather than like, well, this guy told me that it's okay to talk to you, so I guess I will. You know, that just doesn't seem like a good way to run things, especially when you're talking about, you know, pretty close hold information that you wouldn't just want anyone to get their hands on.
Also, Steve, your question assumes that the incoming administration wants information, right? Because you're kind of saying that there's a stick of, if you're going to go in there and get the information, then you have to disclose who's getting it. And that assumes that that information is valuable to the incoming administration. And I could see a scenario where you don't actually care all that much, because you're now in charge, and it's nice to know what happened before, but do you really need it? So
Right.
just
That's
Right.
a
And I
throwback
mean,
to the
yeah.
pre-1960 era, in some.
Yeah, exactly. It's more sort of ad hoc and idiosyncratic. And what you see in the theme of both the Transition Act and its 7 amendments over time is an increasing formalization, an increasing bureaucratization, right? Increasing role for the apparatus of the federal government to sort of build structure around this transition. And it could be that we are now about to enter a phase of like a less structured transition, a less formalized transition. And I don't think that anybody has really started unpacking whether that's the right direction to move. I mean, I'm not someone who thinks that more structure is always better in all instances, right? But there's always trade-offs at a societal level from more or less structure. And so those, I think, are interesting questions. And I think we've got now two transitions back to back that really strain our notion that, you know, more formality is necessarily going to be embraced by the transition teams themselves. So if there's things that we want transition teams to do, we might have to come up with other levers to force them to do it, because they might, under the current structure, they can simply opt out.
So, you know, early on in our conversation today, I was focusing our attention on that first few week period after election day. Let me go to the opposite end and ask, after inauguration day, how much work do transition team members typically continue to play?
So at least within the structure of the transition team, it's basically down to a skeleton crew of people who are kind of closing up, kind of like winding up a business, right? So they're sort of offboarding people, they're getting the computers back, they're sort of, doing the sort of shutdown activities for the transition. And people who are going to be part of the administration or seeking jobs in the administration basically just switch over into that posture. So I was involved with the transition up until I think it was the morning of January 2020. And then it's like the system just shut off. And I was like, all right. And I was in Colorado. So it was even more like, all right, I guess I'll go for a hike. It was just kind of over. Because it really just like poof, you kind of just lose your relevance, right? Almost immediately, because now, but you lose your relevance in the best way because these people that you've worked so hard to get up to speed, take the baton and then they go govern. So it's a very funny short role, but one that was really my absolute privilege to be part of.
In your immediate experience or direct experience, what proportion of the transition team went on to positions in the administration, and was that typical?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't even know how to estimate that. I mean, I guess of the people that I knew and sort of worked closely with on the transition, maybe a third went in for full-time work into the administration in different capacities. Um, but I have to think about that a bit. But it's definitely not everyone. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's interesting because you could think like, okay, everyone here is gonna go ahead and take their seat in the administration once, after January 20th. But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, a lot of folks, were doing this part-time in addition to the rest of their lives and work. And then they just go back to whatever that was, once it's over. It really is just this short role. But I think for folks that go in, that also provides some continuity between the types of issues that you're talking about on the transition and actually being able to govern. I mean, one of the things that I did that we haven't talked about also is that I helped review a number of draft executive orders that the administration was interested in issuing, on day one and beyond. Yeah, there was sort of this historic number of executive orders, which as a scholar, I have mixed feelings about, right? But sort of as part of somebody working on a transition team, it was a thrill to help put these things together and make sure that they received, the input of a lot of different folks. And so
When
that type of stuff, you basically leave that in the hands of the people who are then going to go, execute.
when you say as a scholar you had some mixed feelings about that, are you saying you had mixed feelings about some of the substance of these day one executive orders, or you had mixed feelings about executive orders on day one as a chair?
I think mostly the latter. I mean, certainly like one can have one's own personal views about like the content of any individual EO, but I think, as I think about the relative role and weight and power of Congress vis-a-vis the executive, like I think our increasing emphasis on the unilateral president, the doing it with a stroke of a pen type of view of the modern presidency, I think you can. I haven't pulled the numbers on this, but one interesting thing to look at would be to look at the number of, week one or day one executive orders as presidents try to follow through on various campaign promises. And those campaign promises, over time, it seems to me at least, are increasingly about going it alone, right? Like doing things on your own without needing Congress. And so I think what I mean by, as a scholar, some of that gave me pause is like, it's like this ongoing and increasing trend of a president saying, I don't need Congress, I can go it alone, right? And like, I just don't think that's a recipe for a successful American style of government. I mean, I think, Congress has an important role to play in so many policy issues. And so as exciting as it was professionally to work on a lot of those matters during the transition, it gives me pause about sort of where we're going overall as we look to the president to be the one who can do it all on his or her own.
Yeah, that's a
Although
very
that,
good point. Bridge, I would just add, I would also think that congressional legislation is subject to a lot more vetting than an executive order issued on day one.
Yes and no. I mean, also, the trend in legislation, at least at the federal level, is sort of bigger bills that get a lot of stuff stuffed in them at the very end with a lot of changes under cover of night. And so I think the old school style of Schoolhouse Rock or, Madisonian steps of legislative process guarantee more scrutiny, more oversight, more time to work over the ideas. But we're increasingly seeing the use of these huge omnibus bills with all kinds of riders, stuffed in. So we got work to do in Article 1 and Article 2, my friends. Like both need to clean up their acts. And so that, I guess that's what I mean, Steve, when I talk about like my perspective as somebody who's trying to zoom out and think about, okay, where are we going as a country?
Yeah, and that criticism or that concern about executive orders could easily apply to executive orders on day 100 or day
For
300,
sure.
right?
For
It's
sure.
not, it's just about the scope of executive orders today. And from the standpoint of a new administration's first day in office, it actually seemed to me quite natural that you'd have a whole raft of executive orders, but that they would be narrow in their ambit. It would be about what now I want as the head of this executive branch to be saying to my team about how to, not so substantive about the external world and so forth, but just how the executive branch is going to operate, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
I don't quite know how to articulate that.
No, I hear
Yeah.
what you're saying. And I think so. The reason why I think I disagree is that on day one, all you have had access to on these draft executive orders is, a small handful of civil servants who are sort of approved to talk to the transition team on these matters. But it's a very small number. And you've got the benefit of the transition team themselves. What you don't have is what the president has on January 20th, which is access to the vastness of the federal government to run those ideas and those executive orders by. And so if you have an executive order, like some of Trump's early, immigration executive orders were incredibly fraught on a lot of levels. But one of the ways was that operationally, nobody knew what to do on the ground with them, right? So you had, even if you were completely on sides with the policy goals of those early immigration orders, the people on the ground figuring out who to admit into the country and how to treat them were like, we don't have enough guidance to actually know what you want from us, right? So one of the things that OMB does and that I was attempting to do during our transition period was basically put those policy directives through a sort of know-how meat grinder, right? Like, how are we actually going to turn this lofty policy statement into something that bureaucrats and others on the ground can actually execute? And the transition team, as wonderful as they are, as wonderful as the folks I worked with were, it's never going to replicate the vastness of the expertise of the whole federal bureaucracy. So shifting so many operational style executive orders to day one, I think really is vulnerable to just getting out of the gate with some structural problems, whether they're legal or operational or budgetary or what have you, right? And they're just not ready for prime time necessarily on day one. And so I think looking at the total number of executive orders is also kind of goes to this point, but there's something about those early days of governing where, front loading all of those policy directives to me seems really vulnerable. But like the details of those directives are vulnerable.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Well, this has been really interesting, Bridget. We appreciate your expertise and your joining our episode today. Um, in a moment, I'll ask Tony to turn to a trivia question for us, as we tend to do at the end of each episode. But any final questions or observations about the transition process from anybody?
Yes, Bridget, what's your sense? I know it's so difficult looking from the outside, but what's your sense of how this presidential transition is going from the Biden team to the Trump team? It's so amazing since they have a lot of experience with this, with each
It's
other,
true. Yeah,
with Trump
yeah,
to
true.
Biden and now Biden to Trump.
I don't know. I mean, I think we can just, I mean, transition periods are usually a period of opacity because even if you know the names of who is on an agency review team, for example, there's so much that you can't see. I mean, even in the when the disclosure apparatus is working correctly, I mean, you would only get the names of the agency review team folks and not the potentially hundreds or thousands of other people in a transition. So, and there a period of time when there's so much in play, right? When even just thinking about potential nominees, right? And we've seen a lot of that play out in our headlines for these like top cabinet officials, for example. But there's personnel decisions being made right now that we're not seeing any coverage of because they're just sort of not breaking through to something, or folks are making the choices not to unveil those yet. So I think that's normal. I mean, I think transition teams always play that kind of stuff pretty close to the vest. So honestly, I don't know. I mean, I can tell you that this incoming transition team is sort of has been missing some milestones that we would expect. But I think as we've discussed, they're clearly making an informed decision about what they do and don't want exposure to. And we'll just have to see. I mean, we'll see what day one looks like. We'll see what comes out on the first day. There's certain things that I'm expecting to see and curious to see about day one. And a lot of us out here will be assessing, those early executive actions to see how they square with what our expectations are. So I don't know. We're kind of in wait and see mode, but to some extent, that's always the transition period. But thanks again for having me. It was really fun to talk about all this.
Yeah, well, thank you again, Bridget. Well, Tony, give us a trivia question and first an answer to the previous episode's trivia question.
Yes, Steve. Our previous trivia question was, who is the president with the record for the most unsuccessful Supreme Court nominations, a dubious distinction? And the answer is John Tyler. As our viewers will recall, he was the president in the 1840s. He's really most famous just for the presidential slogan the year he was elected vice president, and that is the famous slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, in 1840. Tippecanoe was William Henry Harrison. He fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and he was elected president in 1840 with Tyler as his running mate. And then Harrison, of course, got pneumonia a month or so into his presidency and died. So Tyler served as president for almost all of William Henry Harrison's term, and Tyler was generally a very unsuccessful president, as his Supreme Court record showed. And our trivia question for our next episode, or today's trivia question, the answer of which will be revealed in our next episode, is focused on presidential transitions, the topic of today's episode with Bridget. And the question is this: who was the last president inaugurated on March 4 instead of January 20? Stay tuned for our next episode when we will reveal the answer.
This is truly trivia.
Yes,
excellent.
It's just so fun to have a historian as part of our election law team. So thank you for that again, Tony. And thanks.
My pleasure.
Thanks to Tony and Terry for being with us again today. And a special thanks once more to Bridget for joining us as our guest. And that'll do it for this episode of Law and Democracy. Thanks.